Well, I'm joined here with Mike Cosper, who I'm glad to say definitely does not look like a fat lesbian, as many of his critics have alleged. That's the one thing he definitely does not have. I don't know, maybe he's got some other failings or some quirkiness, but that's not one of them. Mike, it's great to be with you.
I am honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
And now, Mike, you're best known for a very famous podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which sent waves around the world globally as you told the story of the rise and then the implosion of a ministry, a church, and people's lives. And there were like groups in Australia that were meeting together to
Mm,
discuss the weekly episodes of the podcast. So I don't know whether you're
mm.
aware of that. Your reach extends even to the southern hemisphere, but we had people sitting around talking about this. How do we relate to our own experience? I mean, some of it's very, I find, American centric, but it
Mhm.
certainly resonated with us and the concerns and the dangers of celebrity pastor culture, that kind of thing. So yeah, you did some fantastic work in that, and you had a global response. But this is now kind of your own story that you're talking about. You've got the book out, Land of My Sojourn: The Landscape of a Faith Lost and Found, which again, as I was telling you before, I thought the subtitle should be "The Fall and Rise of Mike Cosper," not in the sense of a Mark Driscoll-esque type of fall, but when you go through all sorts of drama and trauma in life, with a toxic church culture, grieving the death of of your father, of a dear friend as well. You go through your own crucible, your own crucifixion, and then how do you come out, risen in Galilee, as it were. So
Mm.
I thought this was it's quite a concise but a very moving and interesting sort of spiritual autobiography of your life so far. So I mean, do you want to just tell the viewers, Mike, a little bit about what that story is that you narrate in the book?
Yeah, it's a story I didn't have an intention to sit down and write. Funnily enough, about a week ago, I was on Facebook, and Facebook will pop up your Facebook memories, and the one that popped up was from like 5 years ago. Me, saying I'm really excited because I just signed a contract with InterVarsity Press to write a book about the Sermon on the Mount as a sort of a framework for thinking about the church's public witness. That was the book I was supposed to write. And over these years, I was processing my story. I was looking at the Mars Hill story, thinking about telling that. Mars Hill obviously is one of many, many scandals. You all have unfortunately had your share in that hemisphere as well.
Yep.
And and um and and my encounter with that culture and sort of what it did to my soul uh was in a way it was like that was the source of my own writer's block. And there was this day I was having a conversation with a couple of guys, and they were talking about sort of the power of mountaintop experiences. And they were, these guys were from a more sort of formal tradition. Well, one was in a very formal tradition. One had left his evangelical tradition for a more formal tradition. And they were kind of saying, yeah, well, that's just the problem of evangelicalism. It's these mountaintop highs, it sets you up for charisma and all the rest of it. And I was like, no, that doesn't work for me. I mean, because of the transfiguration. Like encounters with glory are part of the Christian life. And through that conversation, I just found myself stuck at the transfiguration and thinking about what that meant for Peter in that moment, what his words meant in that moment and all the rest of it. And I started to see my own story through his story. And so meanwhile, I'm trying to write this book on the Sermon on the Mount. I can't write it. Every time I sit down, I'm just blocked. I'm like, I've never experienced that before. I hate the word writer's block, but it's totally what it was. And so one day I was like, you know what? I just need to write through these thoughts on the Transfiguration and see where they go. And, you know, 40,000 words later, the book came. And the story is about my own exit from ministry. It's both sort of my years in ministry, but really about the experience of going from 15 years of deep idealism and passion and true believing to finding myself on the outside looking in, and having to reassess faith and make sense of past and future from that place of disappointment and disillusionment. And I was fortunate to have community around me, and I was fortunate to have had these moments where I kind of found my story in the Bible
Yeah.
as a as as a as a roadmap, I guess is the way to put it.
Okay, yeah. So it does sound like, you know, a mixture of, you know, Golgotha and Transfiguration is kind of what you
Mhm.
got to. I mean, and there's one quote in the book that really stood out for me, and this was, I don't know if you enjoy the feedback on this, but this is what really stood out for me. The fundamental arc of the Christian story does not ascend from glory to glory; it bends to the cross. I thought that was probably a pretty good summary of what you're doing. I mean, you're interested in the theme of glory, beholding Christ in His transfiguration, but the path to glory goes through the event of suffering, or the event, or the way to paradise goes through the cross. And it sounds like you've experienced things like that in a mixture of spiritual abuse, being, you know, disenfranchised, disempowerment. Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, could you talk about that? That's sort of this. I should call it the dichotomy, or this moving between the sort of, you know, the glory and the suffering, the frustration that you've been through, because these things seem to be side by side the whole way. Even though you have one phase that feels more like Gethsemane than glory. How do you live with this dialectic of going between one and the other all the time?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And what I think happens is, and again, part of what motivated me to write the book was thinking about how often kind of two things happen for Christians who go through bad church experiences. One path is the path of sort of deconstruction, and by that I mean like
Yeah,
not just sort of reevaluation, but truly sort of walking away from the faith
yeah,
and becoming a profound critic of the faith from that point. Uh, or the other sort of parallel temptation is this temptation to um, to just sort of move from one environment of charisma and celebrity personalities to whatever the next one is, you know, the next big church down the road or the next big movement or whatever. And then sometimes you get both. You get somebody who walks out of one of these abusive environments that's very idealistic, and then they latch on to another idealistic movement, just a progressive one,
mm,
from which they then critique the faith.
yeah,
And what I found in my own life was there was no way to abandon the faith for me. It didn't make sense to entirely, and also the circumstances of my life, like I was just haunted by faith everywhere I went.
yeah,
My relationships were all with Christians, and so what I was trying to do, and what I think is so important, is that we have to find a way to assess what went wrong without discounting entirely the meaningfulness of those experiences.
yeah,
I mean, the fact is that like when when Peter is in uh when Peter is at Golgotha watching the death of Christ, that takes nothing away. If he was there, right? Okay, so but when Peter is sort of dealing with when Peter's watching Jesus walk, be marched away, arrested, that takes nothing away from the glory of the experiences that he had. Those weren't suddenly now meaningless. God wasn't absent from those. The beauty of those wasn't diminished in any way. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is talk about, like, we need to honor those experiences for the good that they were. And in fact, for me, coming to a place where I could honor those experiences, but also recognize that there was deep brokenness there, and recognize that life had to move on, right? That season isn't coming back. I can't recreate those moments either. That's kind of what the book is really about, because I think that's the path through disillusionment that doesn't lead to sort of deconstruction or
yeah.
um,
That sounds right.
recreating idealism.
How do you do like a post-event diagnostic
Hmm.
without being disillusioned at the end of it? And, you know, I think that's very much why we need to recapture the sense of, being a reflective Christian,
Mhm.
rather than just driven by moods, impulses, um, that kind of knee-jerk reaction we have. To actually sit down and have a kind of relational and spiritual decompression from some event. I have to say, as I read this book, I kept thinking of how much it reminded me of a friend of mine, Amy Bird's book, Hope in Our Scars, and some of the
Mhm.
church experiences that she's been through. Obviously,
Mhm.
someone of a different order than what you've been through, but with considerable overlap. So I kept thinking, oh man, I wish Amy was here. She'd be great on this, and she'd be going, oh yeah, I can
Yeah.
relate to that. But yeah, let me just give one other quote from readers, which I think dovetails in this theme you've been talking on. You say, the cross means participation in future glory for sure, but too often we gloss over the gritty reality of whips and nails. And
Mhm.
yeah, like I said, yeah, I think you're very good that the path to glory runs through the cross, and that's for me was the biggest takeaway of the book. And it's not just one; there's both. Or I mean, what's the old saying? To put in a different idiom, you got to have grit to go with the gravy. Would be another way of expressing it. There are a few haunting quotes in this book that I find when you're talking about people you've encountered. Early on in, I think, 2016, when Trumpomania began to take over America, you had I think, a friend or a colleague said, someone is finally going to stand up for the white man. Um,
Mhm.
I've been to, I visit America once or twice a year, Mike, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of controversy around race and immigration and stuff, but I've never thought of white people there as a kind of endangered species, or that being, oppressed in any sense. Maybe a loss of hegemony in some cultural aspects, but I've never. I mean, is the Trump phenomenon part of the toxic church culture that's arisen in the last few years?
It's a great question. I've been asked that question many times, and it's come up in other venues. I mean, I think one of the most interesting um, one of the most interesting quotes about the Trump phenomenon was from 2016, and it was actually from John MacArthur. And this was when MacArthur was still anti-Trump, and kind of that whole school of reformed guys, reformed evangelicals were anti-Trump. And he said, when I see Trump and I see evangelicals rallying around him, the person I want to blame is Mark Driscoll, because Driscoll introduced this kind of crass, brash masculinity and made it acceptable, and we lowered our standards to something like that to make
Yeah.
a candidate like Trump, accessible. Um, I don't know how true that is. I don't think Mark was actually that influential in
Mm.
evangelicalism at the time.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in hearing uh, John MacArthur reassess that comment in the light of his endorsement of Donald Trump. I doubt that means he's ready to embrace
Yeah.
Driscoll.
Yeah.
Um, but nonetheless, I what I think what I think for sure is that they reflect a similar desire for uh they reflect a similar, like populism in general
Mm.
tends to gravitate to the leader, the big leader, the personality. Um and populist movements in the last 150 years have all sort of tended to gravitate around a singular personality, and they've rarely ended well. So I think there's something inside some of our large church movements that imitate that structure. And they often imitate a certain kind of like utopian ideology as
Mm.
well. Like for Marcel, it was like, man, if you get masculinity right, like we're gonna reach all of Seattle. Like getting masculinity right is actually the key to getting the gospel to all these people and changing our city and changing the world and all the rest. And populism offers similar cures, and it offers similar kind of strong men to advance them. Um, it's a good question for us. I mean, I think one of the reasons we're drawn to that stuff is because our imaginations, our spiritual imaginations, are so impoverished.
Mm.
That's the closest thing to transcendence we can get, is those sort of utopia on earth, heaven on earth visions of cultural transformation or making America great again, or um whatever else it is that people are sort of rallying to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my experience from my travels is some places they think Trump is the root of every evil that's
Hmm.
going wrong. In other places, it's like it's happening in a different galaxy or something along those lines.
Hmm.
I was going to say the other quote that really struck me within the book is where you said that in some church settings you were in, it felt like healing, restitution, or was just one conversation away, but it never
Hmm.
happened. Could you
Yeah.
unpack that a bit for me?
Yeah, that was actually a quote I took from Tim Smith, who was a Mars Hill guy. And I'll never forget the day he said it, because when he said it, I was like, I know exactly what that feels like. Um, you know, people who, and I think this is true of fallen leaders as well, like people who sign up for church ministry, you're always idealistic. And part of what comes along with it is this natural impulse to want to believe the best
Yeah.
about the circumstances and about the people around you. And so when a leader starts to make that like turn, like when they start to break bad, right?
Mm,
And they make that turn, part of what happens in the people around them is you have to start telling yourself a story about, well, for one thing, you have to recognize that you've been telling yourself a story for years about who are we, where are we going, what's this mission for, what are the sacrifices for, right? In church planning, especially, it's all sacrifice for the first 5 or 10 years. It doesn't matter how successful you are later. Like the sacrifices are legit and they're hard. So you tell yourself a story. It's worth it because of this. It's worth it because of what we're about. It's worth it because we're on the same team. And then when the problems start to arise, the story has to start fitting all those pieces as well. Well, the abusive behavior is because he's sacrificing so much for these other things. Like the abusive
mm,
behavior is the famous one with Driscoll is people said, well, he's our Martin Luther. He's our big reformational guy, and Luther was a hothead and said things he shouldn't, and this, that, and the other.
mm.
Um, so 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 telling yourself that story is a really critical part of kind of sustaining the illusion. And then there comes a point where the story doesn't fit anymore. You can't you wake up, like, disillusionment is when you wake up and realize, hey, actually this sense I had that we were all rowing in the same direction and going after the same thing, I don't think that's true anymore. I don't believe it anymore. Something else is going on here.
Okay, good. Well, apart from a bit of empathy for yourself, from several of the ups and downs you've had, and some real low moments, what do you hope readers take away from this book? I mean, how can reading your somewhat spiritual autobiography here, how can that
Mhm.
speak and help other people in their lives? I mean,
Yeah.
you've mentioned like there's ways of dealing with, drama and toxicity besides the sort of the deconstruction way. Is there anything you think this book will help other people in some sort of way in their, I don't know, church life, spiritual life, or anything like that?
Well, there's kind of two tracks in the book, in terms of the narrative. One is my story, and then the other are these biblical characters, mostly Peter, but then there's a couple of Elijah chapters there, and hopefully it makes sense to readers how that all fits when they read it. But the the reason for that is because I really want readers who are, I think a lot of people who are going to come to the book are in a place where they're trying to make sense of disillusionment in one
Mm,
form or another, either for themselves or for loved ones or for their community of faith or whatever. And the reason it was important to me to have kind of both elements in the book is because I want readers to understand that that experience of disillusionment and disorientation is a really normal thing. Like it's a normal part of the spiritual life to reach a point where you go, none of this makes sense anymore. What I thought I was after has proven not to be true. And now I don't know where to turn. And in these two characters, in both Peter and Elijah, they both come to these moments where it doesn't, the story doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't add up, and they have to sort of radically reevaluate things. And it's in that radical reevaluation that they encounter God in a fresh way and in a different way, and it leads them into a different sense of who they are and what their purpose is. So to me, I mean, I had a friend read it. This was after I had submitted the manuscript. You've probably experienced something like this. I had a friend read it, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "You know, to me, the theme of the book is the idea that like your dreams will get God will crush your dreams, and that's a good thing." And I was like, "Oh man, I wish I'd thought of it that simply." Like you just put it so simply.
I wouldn't have put that on the subtitle, mind you. I mean, that's a bit. Yeah, life sucks, and so do you. Yeah, it's kind of
exactly.
Yeah,
but I think that's kind of it is that like this sense that we're going to come to the end of ourselves at some point. That's a normal part of the spiritual life, and my hope is that people who are there who feel like, man, what has gone wrong, can read it and go, oh wait, like maybe this is actually normal. Maybe I'm like in the normal place because I'm in this dark place.
I've had my dreams crushed. I never became a kickboxing champion and writing musical theater for Broadway, nor did I marry Cindy Crawford. So, you know, all of us get our dreams crushed at some point or other. But anyway, well, Mike, it is a pleasure to talk to you. This was a really good book. I found I could read this like a bit of an evening and a morning, and I was able to go through it. It was such an easy, delightful read. So, Land of Our Sojourn for all the readers out there. And I think this is a spiritual biography. Like you've said, a lot of people are going to find very relatable. And I think it shows, and this is one of my takeaways, is you show that there is a place of healing and renewal. Okay, the fog will lift. You can get out of the slough of despond, and Jesus is still there with open arms and all His glory at the end of it. So that's what I took away for it. But yeah, Mike, it's a pleasure to speak to another Mike, and I wish you every success with the book and the continuing promotion and publicity. And yeah, I hope many people read the story and they find rejuvenation from it.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me to be here.